Hey everybody, Matt here, and we're going to take a look at the HDR deathmatch today. It's not a deathmatch, it's more like an overview. No software is going to die. It's like an overview review of some of the HDR software that's out there, because a lot of them produce different styles and looks, and I think that's a keyword we're going to come back to in a minute. And everybody wants something a little bit different from that HDR process. So I feel like I almost have to tell you a little bit about how that came about. And by the way, if that bugs you and you're gonna go leave a comment that says just get to it, don't leave that comment. Just grab the little scrubby slider and scrub forward 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. It won't kill you. And as soon as you see a software screen, you'll know I'm talking HDR. But for the rest of you, this kind of came about. I'm doing April 25th, 2019. I'm releasing the biggest landscape photo editing course for Adobe, Lightroom, and Photoshop that I've ever done. I realized I've been in my own business for like 3 years and I've never done a landscape editing course. I've done some elsewhere, but it was 4 or 5 years ago. So much has changed. So I went out to my email community. I want to make it different. Number one, I wanted photos. I don't want to use my photos because I use my photos all the time. It's the same stuff. I have the same problems, same genre, same everything. I want your photos because I want to get your problems out there, and I want to be able to directly see things that were going on in photos so that I could help in a better way. The other thing is I did a survey because I wanted to know what to include. Like, what are you not learning about? Where are you stuck? Even though there's a lot of landscape photo education out there, what things are you stuck on? Lots of creative and fine art stuff came back. I covered that, covered the technical. But one thing came up over and over again, and it was HDR. And I was really surprised. And then as I started digging into it, I started realizing I think the problem is that every HDR software has its own footprint, its own fingerprint, if you will. Footprint, fingerprint, same thing. And they have a little bit of a different style. And I think that's where we can kind of get caught up. And so I wanted to go through, kind of let you know where those styles start to emerge and what one might be best for you. Okay, so think of this as a free bonus video. If you buy the course, we don't have to talk software. We can get right into the editing stuff because we talk software here. If you don't buy the course, hopefully it helps you figure out what software might be best for you. All right, we'll take a look at the mainstream ones. Photomatix, Adobe, Aurora, a little bit about ON1 and Affinity, but honestly, I know there's a lot of programs out there. It's really the mainstream. Those are the ones I get asked about the most. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. So we're going to kick it off really where it all started, which is Photomatix. It is arguably really the first. It is, and it might not be the very first HDR merge program of all times, but it's really where what made HDR popular and what kind of kicked off the mainstream release of HDR 10 years ago. So we're going to go in here. I'm going to go click on Browse, and we're going to load some photos up here. I'm going to use the same 3 bracketed photos, and I don't really want to talk about the shooting process, and it's not going to necessarily be a tutorial in each product. This is more about comparing each one together. So let's go ahead and grab our 3 photos here. I'm going to load them up, and when it comes to your base kind of before you even do your merge, the one cool thing about Photomatix is it lets you check exposures. So you can actually see, like, it's going to tell you if you've got your under and overexposed photos cover the scene enough to make a successful HDR, which is kind of neat. Let's go ahead and hit the little merge dialog box there. We can go ahead and align our photos, which most programs have that as well. If you've got noise or chromatic aberration problems. In fact, I use HDR and chromatic aberrations usually go hand in hand, so I'll usually turn that on. That's a little fringing around contrasty edges. White balance, all that stuff, I leave that. That's all going to be stylistic changes when I'm done. So let's go ahead and kick off the merge process. While it's merging here, I just want to say thanks. You could see I'm using some photos from Jeff Negro. So Jeff is part of my email community, and this video kind of touches on my upcoming fine art and creative landscape editing course. And I did something very different in that course, in that I went out to my email community and I solicited photos of other people's photos because I don't want to use mine. I always use my photos, and I have a certain shooting style and a certain subject matter, and I wanted to make sure that this course opened it up to all types of different shooting styles and subject matter and problems with photos and all that other stuff. So big thanks to Jeff for allowing me to use his bracket series here. Okay, so first impressions from Photomatix. Number one, the interface does look like it came out of 1998. It's the interface hasn't changed much over the years. The underlying code behind it and the software, the way it works, has, but the interface still looks very much the same as it did 10 years ago. I've always thought it looked blue. I've always thought it had a very cold, purpley blue look to it. It bothers some people. It doesn't bother me because HDR is not the final stop for me. Any photo that I merge to HDR is always going to get put back into my Lightroom library. And by the way, Photomatix does have a plugin for Lightroom. It's always going to get put back in there. And I'm going to do my stylistic coloring and color toning and tinting and all that stuff when I'm done. So I can see beyond it. If you're not the type of person that can, that may be a turnoff for you for Photomatix because it does kind of start off that way. As far as the settings go, we're going to go up here to the top, and there's a bunch of presets over on the right-hand side like most programs have, but we're going to go to the top. There's the core of any HDR merging program is really going to be these top settings here. Photomatix, we've got detail and we've got tone. I can just save you the trouble from all the other ones. You would not use them. We've got Detail Enhancer, which is the kind of the tried and true old HDR. It's got a surreal type of a look to it. And I would say if you like Photomatix, then you like more of a surreal type of a look to your HDR. Now, everybody, because there's people watching this and you're very, very confidently saying, well, I prefer natural HDR merge. Guess what, guys? Everybody says that. But what you say and what you do are different. Okay. I teach enough workshops. I do enough live presentations where I hear people say that all the time. And then I look at their images and I'm like, you do know this isn't natural, but we get desensitized to it. And that's fine. Okay. If you like a little bit more of that surreal look, that's where Photomatix can go. Now, the strength is generally the strength of the HDR effect, right? That surrealness. Tonal compression, whenever you see compression, to the left is generally going to be more real, brighter highlights, darker shadows, which is typically how our camera sees it. To the right is going to be typically darker highlights, brighter shadows, which is what HDR is trying to help us with so that we don't have to do manual exposure blending. Contrast is exactly that. It's going to add contrast. We've got a couple other things down here when it comes to highlights and white points and black points and saturation and temperature and all that. And all that is stuff I'm going to do after the fact. I only want my HDR program to merge the exposures for me so that I don't have to go into Photoshop and do it myself. That's all I want out of my HDR program. If you want more, then maybe these settings are something that you should look at and something you should kind of examine as you start to go through and evaluate HDR software. Okay. Now, if we go down here to the tone balancer. Tone balancer is said by Photomatix to be its newer, more realistic HDR merge. Of course, you've got your good old strength here, which can get really crazy if you want it, which I would not advise. You've got lighting, which is generally lighting. What lighting does is it in Photomatix at least it makes your shadows a little bit more contrasty or a little bit smoother as you start to increase this. You've got a brightness boost there if you want it. You've got micro contrast, which is kind of like clarity, kind of like contrast on smaller details in the photo. Bring that down, you open it up, you see it. It works a lot like clarity or structure settings would. And then your white clip and your black clip and your saturation and all that. So this is said to be a more realistic type of a merge. I still think Photomatix errs on that. Or I don't even say error, but I think Photomatix kind of floats over toward that surrealistic side if you like it. A lot of people like it, even though they say they don't like it, this is what they come to. So that's probably the first one of the oldest ones that is out there, and then still one of the fastest and best ways to merge for a certain style of HDR photo. Okay, so now let's move on to Lightroom. Okay, Lightroom has HDR built in and HDR merge built in. We would click on one photo, shift click on the other one to select all of them. Head up here to the photo menu, go down here to Photo Merge HDR. It'll even do HDR panoramas if you wanted it to. And incidentally, while it's merging that together, it also works inside of Adobe Camera Raw. So if you were to open 3 photos into Photoshop 3, or not however many you shoot for your brackets, what you could do is you'd see them all over here on the left-hand side. Just click on that little film strip and choose Select All. Click on it again and choose Merge to HDR. And it's the same exact thing. Okay, works exactly the same way. So if you're not a Lightroom user, you still have access to the same exact HDR merge inside of Photoshop's Camera Raw. All right, let's hop back over here. Let's get out of Photomatix for now. All right. Oh, I didn't get out of Photomatix. I got out of Lightroom. Let's go do this one more time. Some people might cut this out of their video, but I'm leaving it in. So the cool thing about Lightroom, super fast on the preview. All right, you don't have to wait long on the preview to see if this is something along the lines of what you wanted to do. So that's the good thing. I come up here, you can see it's got an auto alignment setting. It's also got auto settings. I'm going to turn it off. You can see it's going to look like crap without it. I'm going to turn it on just so that you see. I want to show you what it's doing when it's all done. And then it's also got deghosting, which they all pretty much have as well. So deghosting is, at a high level, it's going to pick one of the exposures if there's something moving in there. At a lower level, you're going to see that water is probably going to get a little smoother once I choose the lower level of deghosting. So depending on if you have something moving in your photo, you're going to want to adjust that. You can even see a little bit of an overlay here. You can see what it's deghosting. And then create stack, if you wanted to stack them together inside of your Lightroom library, you can do that as well. So let's go ahead and hit merge. There's not too many settings on here, and we're going to talk about that as it's doing its merge. It is creating the HDR for you. It is going to make a brand new file, as you can see over here, and it's basically a new derivative. It's a DNG file. Okay, so it is now a completely merged version of all of your photos. Let's head over here to develop, and I want to show you what it did. If you head up to the basic panel, this is what the auto did. So the auto checkbox didn't do anything you couldn't have done by not clicking it and coming over here and changing the basic settings. Okay, it's the same as if we came over here and just clicked this auto button inside of there. And Lightroom does a really good job. What I would tell you is that Lightroom is a pretty balanced natural HDR, which again, we've talked about. Everybody says, I like natural HDR. I don't like that garish, horrible stuff. But everybody says that, and 50% of those people that say it still go produce that stuff. Lightroom is going to be your place for natural HDR. It doesn't have all of the micro contrast and the tone mapping and all that stuff. It literally, and it does a great job of it, it literally balances your photos. If you were to look at the original, sun's pretty good here. We can even pull back exposure. Everything looks good there. Everything's too dark. Look at the middle one. Our middle tones look good. You look at the bright one. Bright tones look good too. No noise, but now our sun is way too bright. So it does a great job of blending these together right off of the bat. All right. Now, you still would go through and do all of your other stuff, but just understand this is definitely more of the natural way to go. Okay, this is more of a natural HDR. You're not going to get those surreal tone compressions and micro contrast settings here. You still do get clarity. So if you wanted a little bit of that mid-tone contrast, get your clarity. The thing I like about it, and I'm going to kind of reserve my final opinion till the end, but the thing I like about it is it keeps me all in one place, and I can now go do my stylistic changes, like warming the photo, like adding vignettes, all those things. I can now go do all those things as I'm doing the HDR, basically. Every HDR is going to need shadow tweaks. It's going to need highlight tweaks. It's going to need whites. It's going to need blacks. It's going to need all that stuff. It's kind of nice to get it done all in one place. All right. But again, just understand, you're not going to get those settings that can really, really push this to a different level. Okay. I think it does a nice job with the sun and the shadows though. So that's your Lightroom version. Again, you've got your original photos, and then it's just going to create that new DNG file here of which you can go through and use all of your Lightroom settings on. The biggest difference is this file now has a lot more information. If I take the exposure, look, I can go all black. I can get it to all white. I have much more range and I have much more leeway with my exposure and my highlights and shadows than I would have had I chose any one of these photos individually. So if I had to compare that, I'd say, Lightroom it's not going to get you that surreal look. It doesn't have tonal compression. In fact, its weaknesses is it doesn't have anything that will really get you that gritty, compressed tonal compression, micro contrast look. It does have clarity, but Lightroom strength is not going to be the surreal look. Lightroom strength is more likely going to be that natural blended type of a look. Next up, let's take a look at Aurora HDR, in the scheme of the HDR world, fairly new in the last few years here. We'll go ahead and open up our brackets. It gives you auto alignment. It gives you ghost reduction, chromatic aberration, and all that stuff. So if you wonder, we didn't have chromatic aberration in Lightroom because there's a panel for that. So after we merge, we get a panel for that stuff. But let's go ahead here and hit Create HDR. It's going to go through and merge our photo together for us. And I think initial impressions are definitely a more modern interface than we had with Photomatix. As we look at the overall photo, Aurora is still gonna tend to go toward the surrealistic side. All right, we've got a basic panel over here where we can try to combat that, but it's still got a surrealistic, more of a nature to it. And if you were to compare it to what Lightroom gave us right out of the gate to what Aurora has given us right out of the gate, just Lightroom to me looks a little bit more natural in the shadows and the highlights. Aurora gets a little bit more contrasty of that HDR effect. Pretty close. And I'm sure as we move some of the basic stuff around, we could get more natural with it. But I think it's going out of the gate as a surrealistic type of a thing. The real star to Aurora over here is going to be like this whole HDR Enhance section. Remember inside of Photomatix when I showed you the tone balancer and the detail enhancer, and I said that's where the core is, all in this tone compression and microstructure area. This is that for Aurora. Everything else in here is basically a panel that we'd get inside a Lightroom or whatever raw editor that you're using. There's a couple of things in there like a glow that would be a little bit different, but everything else is more like a panel that you'd see in your raw editor. It's just repeating it, and to me, Aurora is almost assuming you want to do your whole start to finish for the photo right here in Aurora, right? You're not doing HDR as a merging process and then still editing the photo somewhere else. It's giving you all the tools to do here, which could be good or bad for you. To me personally, it's too much, but to other people, they want to get it all done in one place. But this is the section where your settings are going to differ. Think of your clarity as going to be mid-tone contrast. You can look at your histogram. You can see the blacks over here, the whites over here. They don't really move much. It's everything in between. Smart structure is going to be, forget the word smart because, if you haven't noticed, everybody's using the word smart in AI these days just because it's trendy and it sells and people buy it. So, but forget all that. It's basically giving you more of a contrast. You could see here structure and this whole micro contrast look. It brings out details. All right. This is what started the HDR craze in the first place. Like people would crank it up and be like, oh my God, look at all the detail in the clouds and the ground down here. It's gritty and grungy and all that stuff. And that's what started the whole thing to begin with. So be careful with that one. And then you've got microstructure, which is, again, where we can really get into trouble with some of that extra contrast boost, especially with these halos that are around. Although we can come down here and we can smooth some of that out. And now we get this very smooth, it takes some of that grunginess away. Okay. I'm not a big fan of those settings. I'm going to pull them back. But if you want to go crazy with it, they do give you the settings to go crazy with it. Everything else in here is generally from a raw editor, all right? A lot of people do like to put a little bit of a glow on their HDR, so you do have a glow setting here, which is kind of nice. Again, there's filters, there's different ways to put a glow onto your photos, but most everything else in here is really just from a raw editor. So if you merged your HDR together in Photomatix or using something else and you brought it into your raw editor, these are the settings you could see. Okay, so I could probably warm this up a little bit. Of course, you got your shadows and your highlights. The nice thing about Aurora, and if you were to compare it to over Photomatix, Photomatix lets you layer a photo, but it only lets you layer a version of your HDR bracket in there to make it brighter or darker. Photomatix will let you layer everything, anything you want on here. So it could be a version of the photo, it could be a texture, it could be anything. But you could layer a version of the photo. It's got, adjustable gradients and all that stuff. So you could selectively adjust things in the photo as well. Okay, so my thoughts on Photomatix are it does sway a little bit toward that surrealistic side. You can go a little bit more toward the natural side, where I think in Photomatix, getting to that natural side is a little bit more difficult. Moving on down the line, we're going to take a quick look at ON1 Photo Raw 2019's HDR merge here. This is not a program you would buy to merge to HDR if you're not an ON1 user. If you're an ON1 user, then this is what you would do to merge. And I do want to compare it with the others, but you would never be a Lightroom user or a Capture One user and then go buy ON1 to do your HDR merges. So, but as an ON1 user, you'd select your brackets over here, come over here, click on the HDR dialog or the HDR button over there. It's going to bring you into a dialog. You've got your deghosting settings. You've got your looks. You can get natural or you can go surreal, and they're going to kind of give you some adjustments that kind of, lend itself toward those looks, although you'll be able to change those too. It's got some auto alignment options. When you're done, you can open this into the develop module in ON1. You can even choose to say, hey, you know what? I don't want that exposure in as part of this, and you'll see how it kind of changes things there. It's saying, hey, take that out of it. I don't want it to be part of the merge anymore, or at least let me look at what it looks like if that's not part of the merge anymore. Okay. All right. From here, let's go over to the right-hand side. It's actually, before it even does too much, it's actually giving you all of your settings. You could go over here. You could pull back your highlights. You could open up your shadows. You could get to a crazy HDR if you wanted to, or you could try to get to a more natural look. That's your basic panel. And by the way, this is the same thing as a basic panel. In fact, look at my sliders, because you're going to see in a second. And then you've got this HDR look where, again, that's very similar to Photomatix, had that tone compression detail enhancer section. You saw Aurora had it. So if you want to go to that surreal route, then you've got some of these compression and detail and clarity and glow settings right inside of here. When you're done, you click on save, and this is going to create a whole separate file for you. It would have the .on1 extension, so you wouldn't be able to go take this file into another program because it'd be specific to being used inside of ON1. It's kind of like, Lightroom created a DNG file. It didn't just make a whole nother JPEG or TIFF. It made a DNG file. This is going to create a .on1 extension here. Remember how I told you about the sliders that we saw there? That's all it was. It was the basic tone and color stuff. So we didn't do anything permanent in there. We can always come back in here and we can always go in there and change and adjust our white balance, do whatever we wanted to the photo. The sliders we had during the HDR merge process are the same sliders that we have after. Okay. Moving on to the last one here, Affinity Photo. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. It's a good HDR merge. If you come up here, File, go down there, New HDR Merge, grab your photos. This one, again, you're not going to buy Affinity to do an HDR merge. This is for, you're an Adobe subscription hater and you've moved to Affinity. It's a very good program, and it's got a nice HDR merge, and it's even got your little tonal compression settings over on the right-hand side. You can go from flat to surreal. Remember, left is typically going to be more natural. Right is typically going to be less natural. You've got your contrast. You've got your exposure, saturation, vibrance, all of your other panels that you have here inside of Affinity are still going to be available to you. So you get your HDR merged together to basically get control and more control of the tones and the shadows and the highlights. And then you could always come over here on the right-hand side and adjust those things as you need to. Well, I hope that overview helped out a little bit for you. And I think where a lot of the questions come from are people trying to compare features. And if you're trying to compare features, you're going to come to a dead end because they're all pretty much similar. I think once you realize it's the style, it's the fingerprint, it's the look that the software gives you, and they all do have a very specific look. I think that is really what can help the most. And once you realize that, then you're probably better equipped to pick one. Now, I feel like if I don't leave you with a recommendation, the video is useless, right? So here's the deal. If you've got 3 exposures, the sun, dark, bright spots, and dark areas and all that stuff, and you don't want to go into Photoshop and use layers and masks and blend them all in and all that stuff, but you like natural. You like that natural blended look. To me, hands down, Lightroom, Photoshop, Camera Raw, hands down, you go Adobe. All right. Number 1, you can do the whole merge right there. It's all in your library, and you can do all your finishing work on top of it as well. So everything's all in one place. If you've deemed that you like the look, the HDR look, that surreal type of a look, if something in there resonates with you, I would either say Photomatix or Aurora, but I want to give you a winner. If it was Aurora 2018, I'd have picked Photomatix. 2019, the newer version, they've really improved it. The other thing, I used to always say Photomatix because I thought that they were pretty close. They both give you the HDR look, and Aurora's like $100. It's crazy to me. But I think Trey Ratcliffe is part developer. I guess they got to pay him, so it jacks the price up. But then, Photomatix was like half the price, and then I realized Photomatix is $100 now too. So they're both $100, which is ludicrous for HDR software. But all software has gone down. I guess HDR software has gone up in price. So you're going to pay about $100. Again, with the newest version of Aurora, I think that's going to take the win. Okay, folks, hope this helped you kind of figure out where you land on the software. And if you want to learn more about photo editing landscapes in a very creative way, maybe in almost creative meets technical, I hope you'll check out my landscape course over at mattkay.com/landscape.